I can't believe you would do this! After everything!
You don't just inherit land and get to do whatever you feel like with it. That's what she yelled at me, fists planted firmly on her hips, standing right where my grandfather's old boots used to rest. I hadn't even unpacked a single bag. The air still smelled like pine and worn leather in the hallways, but this HOA officer had already stormed onto my porch, clipboard raised like a weapon, rattling off codes and pointing out violations, as if I were some renter she intended to evict. The whole thing felt absurd, arrogant, honestly even threatening. Tell me in the comments, how would you react if someone spoke to you that way on your own land? When my grandfather, Harold Grant, passed last Tuesday, he left me everything: his ranch house, 150 acres of open ground, and the cattle operation that had fed our family since 1875. What he didn't warn me about was the neighbor from hell, a woman who seemed convinced she owned the entire county. I was still in my funeral suit that afternoon, sitting in his worn leather chair, rereading his will one more time. The lawyer had left an hour earlier, and I was just beginning to let the reality of it all sink in when the front door swung open without a single knock. A woman in her early 50s marched straight into Harold's study, as if it belonged to her. Clipboard in one hand, an air of sharp hostility in the other, and absolutely no awareness that she'd just broken the law by barging into someone else's home. She glanced around Harold's study with the same disapproving look a health inspector might give a failing restaurant. I just sat there stunned, wondering if grief was making me imagine things, because the entitlement was so surreal. Strangers parading through my inherited property as though conducting some official inspection. Mr. Grant, I'm Olivia Sharp, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, she declared, settling into Harold's reading chair uninvited. Her tone carried that mix of fake authority and true arrogance that makes most people instinctively check their wallets. I'm here to address immediate compliance issues with your property before they affect our community's home values. I honestly couldn't tell whether to laugh or dial 911, because this woman was treating breaking and entering like it was a scheduled business meeting. Harold's ranch had been in the family since the Civil War era. The deed, tucked neatly into his desk drawer, bore my great-great-grandfather's signature from 1875, verified by territorial records and every county clerk since statehood. Meadowbrook Estates, meanwhile, was a subdivision slapped together in the late 1990s on land that once belonged to the Johnson wheat farm, completely separate from our ranch, with a clear boundary line on every county survey. But Olivia clearly had other ideas about borders, and she was ready to share all of them. She flipped through her clipboard like a prosecutor unveiling evidence. First item, that porch swing on your veranda needs to go. Our architectural standards forbid outdoor. Furniture visible from community roads, and your swing disrupts visual consistency for passing residents. I sat there dumbfounded, trying to make sense of the logic, being ordered to take furniture off my own porch so strangers could enjoy a prettier view. It was like someone demanding I rearrange my living room to please people walking past my windows. Second item, she continued briskly, jotting down notes like she was writing tickets. The oak tree by your front gate needs significant trimming to align with our neighborhood sightline requirements. That oak had been planted by Harold's father in 1923 to honor surviving the Spanish flu. It was older than most of the town itself, probably more valuable than her entire subdivision, yet she wanted it cut back to meet some arbitrary HOA landscaping rule. At that moment, I finally understood why Harold always kept a shotgun within arm's reach of the door. Third item is non-negotiable, she went on, voice clipped. The family cemetery in your west pasture must be relocated to an approved municipal site within 60 days to comply with residential standards. I swear, my brain just froze. This woman was telling me to dig up my ancestors' graves, my great-great-grandfather included, because their presence offended her neighborhood aesthetic. I had to mentally replay her words 3 or 4 times just to confirm I wasn't mishearing. Who in their right mind makes demands like that to someone still in mourning? I should probably point out, I said at last, leaning back in Harold's chair with obvious disbelief, that I'm actually Governor Grant. You may have seen me on the news. Her reaction? Exactly what I expected from someone who had just trespassed against a sitting governor. She blinked, processed for about 5 seconds, then simply went back to reading her clipboard like I'd mentioned my favorite hobby. Governor or not. Mr. Grant, you are bound by the same HOA rules as every property owner here, she insisted, with the confidence of someone who had never once faced consequences. The Meadowbrook Association functions under delegated state authority to maintain property values and neighborhood standards. I couldn't help smirking at that, given I was the one who actually held the state authority she was pretending to represent. I stood and walked to Harold's oak desk where every important document had been meticulously organized. Right on top sat the ranch deed, along with survey maps dating back to territorial days and legal correspondence safeguarding its agricultural heritage status. I spread the documents across the desk. These maps confirmed the boundaries set in 1875 and upheld by the State Preservation Board. The ranch is protected under agricultural heritage law, which overrides subdivision rules. She glanced at the papers for maybe 10 seconds before brushing them aside, proving she had no grasp of property law, or history for that matter. At the bottom of Harold's desk was a built-in safe I'd never once seen opened as a child. The combination was written in his will, along with a note about emergency property protection. I decided to check it later. Harold never prepared for legal fights unless he expected a real threat. Whatever was in that safe had clearly been left for a moment just like this. Escorting Olivia to the door felt less like saying goodbye to a guest and more like marching an intruder out after catching them mid-break-in. I made sure to jot down her license plate number as she climbed into her white sedan and lingered in my driveway for nearly 15 minutes, likely coordinating with whoever else was part of this harassment scheme. From Harold's front window I could see her pacing through phone calls, gesturing dramatically while staring at the ranch house like she was strategizing a military operation. The logical step would have been to press criminal charges immediately. Olivia had already trespassed inside my home without permission, fabricated authority over legally protected historic property, and even threatened to destroy a family cemetery during my grandfather's mourning period. Any reasonable prosecutor would have filed felony charges within hours. But instead I kept thinking about the careful, calculated way she orchestrated this harassment, and I wondered what other outrageous crimes she might attempt if given enough freedom to trap herself completely. I faced a choice: arrest her now, for one offense, or let her build a case strong enough for 20. Harold always used to say good fences made good neighbors, but he never warned about what happens when bad neighbors decide to tear those fences down entirely. His security system had been quietly recording every detail since Olivia's brazen performance in his study, and I was about to realize that watching crimes unfold in high-definition video can be almost as satisfying as catching someone in the act. Before 7 a.m. that morning, motion sensors started sending alerts to my phone. Activity near the west property line, where nothing should have been moving except cattle. I grabbed Harold's old hunting binoculars and settled by the kitchen window where I could see without being seen from the road. 2 men in work overalls approached the fence carrying wire cutters and what appeared to be professional surveying gear, moving with the deliberate precision of people following exact instructions. These weren't random vandals. They knew precisely which sections to cut and why, meaning someone had hired them to sabotage ranch operations in ways designed to cause maximum disruption. She wasn't just slicing through wire. She understood exactly where to clip, how to weaken the gate, and how to disguise the damage as accidental. That wasn't homeowners association enforcement. It was targeted sabotage. Fortunately, the cameras mounted along that fence line were recording everything in razor-sharp detail. Harold had installed professional-grade surveillance 5 years earlier, when cattle theft became a regional problem, and that investment was about to pay off in ways he likely never imagined. Wide-angle coverage, crystal-clear audio, facial recognition, video quality, and GPS timestamps, all the things prosecutors dream about when building airtight cases. I didn't hesitate. I forwarded the footage to Owen and secretly copied a local journalist I'd met 2 years earlier while hosting a town hall. She had already exposed 2 corrupt city council members, and I had a feeling she'd enjoy dismantling a crooked HOA operation. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from the same number Olivia had used the day before. Property correction crew working today. Do not interfere with compliance improvements. 60-day deadline for full standards implementation. Remains firm. I laughed out loud reading it. She had just documented criminal conspiracy in writing. Once again, Olivia was handing prosecutors evidence against herself on a silver platter, as if determined to make their jobs effortless. Meanwhile, the men worked steadily along our fence line, cutting wire with precision, removing posts without, harming the concrete bases, and stacking everything neatly as if they planned to return later for cleanup. The older man kept checking his phone and pointing at different areas, clearly receiving instructions from someone directing the operation, remotely. Their truck bore magnetic signs reading Meadowbrook Property Services, which was either astonishingly reckless or proof they thought they were untouchable. I called my legal team while watching these men dismantle Harold's boundaries like it was routine maintenance. My chief counsel answered right away, probably recognizing the governor's emergency line on his caller ID. "What's going on, Governor?" he asked, and I could hear him flipping open a legal pad before I'd even begun explaining. "I'm watching felony property destruction in real time," I told him. "Criminal conspiracy, coordinated vandalism, possibly fraud, all captured on professional-grade security footage with pristine audio." It took me several minutes to explain Olivia's threats about relocating the cemetery, during which time the crew managed to destroy nearly 400 feet of fencing. My attorney stayed completely silent until I finished describing her plans for Harold's gravesite. "Governor, you're describing orchestrated felonies against protected historic property by someone pretending to wield government authority," he finally said. "We can have arrest warrants executed within 2 hours if you authorize prosecution." But I wasn't ready for immediate arrests. It was clear Olivia had more crimes in motion, and I wanted full documentation. The security system was even recording the workers' conversations, which revealed telling details about their orders. "She said to start near the old cemetery first, then move toward the main house if nobody shows up," the younger one remarked while loading cut wire onto their truck. That single comment alone would carry serious prison time once this reached court. It proved deliberate targeting of the family burial site for maximum emotional harm. By noon, the men packed up their tools and drove away, leaving behind their calling card in the form of Meadowbrook Estates business signs planted at the very scene of their crime. They had, in effect, signed their names to felony-level property destruction. That meant they were either oblivious to the criminal fallout or utterly convinced that their employer's supposed legal shield would protect them while carrying out her harassment campaign. Either way, they had gift-wrapped perfect identification. For law enforcement, once arrests were made, I spent the afternoon making duplicate copies of the surveillance files and organizing everything into evidence packets for court. The cameras had captured license plates, crystal-clear facial shots, entire conversations detailing Olivia's instructions, and exact timestamps for every stretch of fence they tore down. Watching them coordinate vandalism over digital messages was like witnessing someone build their own prison cell one brick at a time. Every spoken word, every text, every recorded second of damage was stacking up into irrefutable evidence for trial. The damage to the fence itself wasn't the real story. It could be repaired in under a week and at a manageable cost. What fascinated me was Olivia's calculated approach. She had studied enough about ranch operations to know exactly which fence lines to target, sections that disrupted cattle management but didn't compromise major infrastructure. The repairs were just costly, enough to prompt immediate police involvement. She'd even hired workers with experience in rural sabotage who could carry out destruction quickly while limiting the time spent on site. In Harold's study sat filing cabinets I'd hardly opened during my childhood visits, packed with legal correspondence chronicling decades of ranch disputes. Previous HOA presidents had tried harassment campaigns before, but never at Olivia's brazen level. Most had restricted themselves to hostile letters about trees or livestock. None had escalated into outright property destruction or threatened to desecrate a family cemetery during mourning. By nightfall, I had assembled complete evidence files: criminal conspiracy, property damage, fraudulent claims of authority, and every text Olivia had sent threatening more harassment. My legal team confirmed we had enough to push for arrests and serious felony charges. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling this was only the opening move in her larger plan to seize Harold's ranch through intimidation and legal manipulation. The security system ran continuously overnight, catching Olivia circling the damaged fence lines multiple times. She stopped her car on 3 occasions to take photos and scribble notes, likely drafting material for bogus insurance claims or false legal filings. She was compiling a meticulous archive of her own crimes, evidence that would make conviction easier than most prosecutors ever get in their careers. Watching her crew wreck my property on camera, I realized each second of footage was worth thousands of dollars in court. An hour later, Owen called, not about the recordings, but to warn me. Someone inside the HOA office had leaked our email, exchanged to Olivia, and she was already plotting her next step. By Thursday morning, I had lost all patience with her ongoing spectacle. Seeing someone deliberately destroy inherited property while recording their crimes stops being morbidly amusing once you grasp they intend to escalate without end. While Owen worked on the restraining order, I called Darren, a retired postal inspector who still carried a quiet vendetta against HOA corruption. I asked him to pose as a curious buyer interested in Olivia's next development project. I needed to uncover how deep her scheme ran. At dawn, walking up the courthouse steps felt like assembling for battle. My lead counsel carried thick folders containing the surveillance footage, property records, and Olivia's incriminating texts. The clerk at the reception desk recognized my voice instantly. Governors don't file personal cases unless it's serious. We need emergency restraining orders against Olivia Sharp and her associates for ongoing criminal harassment of protected state property, my attorney explained, spreading the evidence out. Judge Morrison, a veteran of 20 years of property disputes, studied our documents with grave attention. His expression betrayed astonishment when he realized someone had demanded cemetery relocation from a sitting governor during family mourning. Governor Grant, what you're describing is a deliberate campaign of harassment by an individual, falsely claiming government authority over historically protected ranch land, he said after reading Harold's deed. This court will ensure protection. The restraining order hearing wrapped in under half an hour, largely because Olivia hadn't bothered to secure legal counsel. She didn't know charges were on their way. The judge watched footage of the fence destruction with rising disbelief, especially when audio revealed her team plotting to target cemetery sections for maximum emotional harm. Miss Sharp, you are hereby barred from contacting Governor Grant, his family, or his property, pending criminal investigation, Judge Morrison declared while signing the protective orders, orders that guaranteed any future attempt would result in immediate arrest. When I delivered the paperwork to the HOA office, Olivia didn't blink. She smiled as though she'd just earned a promotion. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, her fingernails clicking against her clipboard. I stayed silent. "The judge will," I finally said. Her tone carried that unnerving mix of counterfeit authority and real entitlement that makes people instinctively check their wallets. Even with felony charges looming, she couldn't accept that HOA power stopped at the edge of private property. Deputy Martinez was assigned to serve the orders and spelled out the legal consequences in terms Olivia couldn't possibly misinterpret. Martinez had been handling harassment cases for 15 years, yet the look on his face said he'd never seen anything like someone trying to wield HOA authority over a governor's historic ranch. "Miss Sharp, any violation triggers immediate arrest and extra felony charges," he explained. Olivia, however, kept arguing that community compliance outweighed court-issued protection orders. Driving back to Harold's ranch, I felt as if I'd just unleashed nuclear weapons on someone tossing pebbles. The restraining order barred Olivia from contacting me, coming near the ranch property lines, or orchestrating any action that interfered with our agricultural work. Breaking those terms meant instant arrest and additional charges, penalties that could stretch her prison time by years. But watching her skim the paperwork, I doubted she was sharp enough to realize she'd been completely defeated. Inside Harold's locked safe were documents showing exactly why he had been preparing for this legal battle all along. Letters from state preservation agencies, federal agricultural designations, and correspondence with attorney general offices about shielding ranch operations from development schemes. Harold had long expected attempts at property seizure through relentless harassment, and he'd built legal defenses strong enough to make such efforts collapse. That night, my security system picked up Olivia actively surveilling the ranch blatantly, ignoring her restraining order. She circled the main gate 3 times, stopping to snap photos of fence work and jot notes. Each pass counted as another violation, the kind that justified immediate arrest, and she was racking up contempt charges faster than most criminals do in their entire careers. I called Deputy Martinez and reported the violations as they happened. "Governor, we can serve arrest warrants right away if you want full enforcement," he said once I described her ongoing surveillance. "She's given us enough for serious contempt charges that could add years to her sentence." But I hesitated. Part of me wanted her to keep stacking up infractions, letting her spiral into an even bigger legal disaster instead of cutting it short. Security footage showed her sedan circling past the ranch repeatedly, each time stopping, for photographs that violated every clause of her court order. She was literally documenting her own contempt, somehow convinced that this campaign of harassment would undo her legal disaster instead of making it exponentially worse. By midnight, she had broken the restraining order 17 separate times, all captured in crystal-clear footage with precise timestamps. The next morning, I spotted tire marks along the old cemetery path on the western edge, an area no vehicle had touched in decades. A small orange flag was planted in the dirt near my grandfather's headstone. While I had been focused on building the case against Olivia, something else had started brewing in the Meadowbrook subdivision, something I hadn't anticipated. Harold's ranch wasn't her only target. Olivia had been applying her twisted sense of HOA authority to her own neighborhood, and now her neighbors were rallying against her in ways that had nothing to do with my criminal case. Instead of more angry group messages, people began making flyers. Screenshots of her HOA violations appeared on utility poles. By midday, a petition titled "Remove Olivia Sharp, Restore Respect" had surfaced, and by dinnertime it already had 400 signatures. Ella Dawson lived just 3 houses down from Olivia, in a modest 2-story colonial she'd been slowly renovating over the last 10 years. In her 40s, a middle school teacher by profession, Ella clearly had the organizational skills that come from wrangling 7th graders who treat rules like mere suggestions. She had been quietly documenting Olivia's harassment of neighbors for months, compiling files detailed enough to make prosecutors envious, but Ella had no intention of waiting for the courts to fix what she believed the community itself could solve. The conflict began when Olivia declared Ella's vegetable garden a violation of aesthetic standards, demanding she tear out every food-producing plant. In Olivia's view, community rules required residents to maintain strictly decorative landscaping. Nothing practical, nothing edible. Ella had been growing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in her backyard for 15 years without a single complaint from previous HOA boards. Olivia, however, saw the garden as incompatible with the neighborhood's upscale image. She came to my door Tuesday morning with a violation notice, Ella told me on the phone Wednesday afternoon. Said I had to remove every food plant by Friday or face daily fines starting at $200. Her voice carried the steady fury of someone who'd finally had enough of authoritarian nonsense. "Hayden, I've spent 2 decades teaching kids what it means to be responsible citizens, and yet this woman makes middle school bullies seem reasonable by comparison." That's when it hit me. While I'd been wrapped up in her ranch-related offenses, Olivia had actually been carrying out a pattern of harassment against several of our neighbors. One man even handed me a photo of his dad fishing with mine, right along the creek Olivia now insisted was HOA property. "Don't let her erase us," he told me. By Thursday evening, Ella had pulled together a neighborhood meeting focused on leadership, accountability, and protecting residents' rights. When I drove by her house that night, nearly 30 cars lined the streets, roads that normally sat empty after dinner. Through the front windows, I caught glimpses of people clutching paperwork, their animated gestures making it clear long-held grievances were finally being voiced aloud. The agenda they'd assembled rivaled the detail of a city council session. Neighbors had gathered proof of bogus fines, arbitrary rule changes, violation notices based on imaginary infractions, and demands for home alterations that went far beyond anything an HOA was authorized to enforce. Olivia had been running Meadowbrook like her personal kingdom, rolling out policies without any resident approval and using threats of legal action to silence anyone who questioned her increasingly heavy-handed control. Mrs. Patterson over on Maple. Street had been ordered to remove her flower boxes for supposedly blocking sightlines that didn't exist. The Rodriguez family was fined for parking their work van in their own driveway, citing aesthetic standards that had never been voted on. And Bob Williams was told to take down his American flag because it didn't fit within decoration guidelines that weren't even in the original HOA charter. Every household had their own story of Olivia's arbitrary rule enforcement. She's been charging us special assessment fees for improvements that never materialize, announced Jim Foster, a retired accountant who had been combing through the HOA's financial records with meticulous care. Drainage projects that were never begun, landscaping contracts with companies that don't exist, legal fees for services nobody ever approved. The room fell silent as it sank in. Their HOA president might not just be overreaching, she could be stealing from them. Then Ella stood up, holding a folder so thick it could choke a horse, packed with months of investigation into Olivia's actions. I've already contacted the State Consumer Protection Office about unauthorized collections and possible fraud in HOA management, she declared. The applause that followed was so loud it likely shook houses 3 blocks away. We're also filing harassment complaints under state homeowner protection laws. The residents weren't just rallying, they were preparing for a legal fight. The most startling revelation came from Tom Bradley, who worked in construction management and knew building codes inside and out. Half the violations she's citing aren't even real, he explained, laying out county documents as proof. Standards she claims are mandatory aren't listed in HOA covenants or county codes at all. She's been inventing rules and threatening lawsuits over requirements that don't exist. By the time the meeting ended, the residents had unanimously voted to demand Olivia's resignation and call for new HOA leadership elections within 30 days. They had compiled evidence of financial misconduct, harassment of multiple families, and blatant violations of residents' rights, enough to support civil lawsuits and even criminal charges. Meadowbrook was finally taking its neighborhood back from a leader who had treated an elected role like absolute rule. That same night, a newsletter was slipped under every door announcing a mandatory compliance review called by Olivia. I knew that tone. It wasn't a meeting. It was a purge. Then Monday morning brought the kind of call that turns a criminal case upside down. My chief of staff tapped on my office door, his expression caught between triumph and disaster. And I couldn't tell which possibility worried me more. "Governor, the state attorney's office says someone's ready to make a deal," he said, shutting the door with deliberate care. Martin Greer was waiting downstairs, asking for immunity in exchange for testimony about conspiracy and fraud tied to the ranch property. I'd never even heard his name until that moment, but it turned out he'd been working alongside Olivia. Since the very start of her harassment campaign, the man sitting in my conference room looked like every development consultant I'd ever run across in politics. Expensive suit, restless energy, and that desperate sort of charm that only shows up when someone knows their scheme is about to come crashing down like a house of cards in a storm. "Governor Grant, I want to be completely open about my role in the Meadowbrook situation," Martin began, his hands shaking as he spread documents across the table. "6 months ago, Olivia Sharp contacted me about acquiring your grandfather's ranch for resort development. I provided consulting services that may have stepped outside legal boundaries. That was his diplomatic way of admitting he'd been helping run an organized harassment campaign against government property, while also drawing up fraudulent schemes that federal prosecutors would salivate over." Listening to Martin's confession was like watching someone take apart a bomb while narrating how they built it in the first place. He explained that he and Olivia had been mapping out weaknesses in Harold's property rights, looking for ways to pressure a forced sale through harassment and fabricated zoning violations. The fence cutting, threats to the cemetery, and bogus compliance demands, all of it was part of a deliberate plan to make the ranch unmanageable until I caved and accepted their lowball offer. "We looked into your grandfather's finances and assumed he couldn't survive long legal battles with the HOA," Martin said, oblivious to the fact that Harold had been preparing defenses for exactly this kind of attack. "Their scheme was to ratchet up the pressure until I sold at farmland rates instead of development value, saving investors about $12 million. I sat there while Martin described organized crime as casually as if he were presenting market research. The papers he handed over included harassment timelines, financial projections for a forced acquisition, and correspondence with investors funding the operation. Olivia hadn't been improvising or acting out of impulse. She'd been executing. A strategy designed by professionals who knew exactly how to weaponize HOA authority against property owners. I have recordings of planning sessions with Olivia where we discussed specific tactics to make your ranch financially unsustainable, Martin went on, producing a device that likely contained enough evidence for federal charges: conspiracy, property destruction, fabricated regulatory claims, even contingency plans to contaminate the water supply if everything else failed. That revelation chilled me. These people had been willing to commit crimes that could have killed livestock and put human lives at risk. Martin wasn't confessing out of remorse. It was pure self-preservation. Federal investigators had started digging into his records after our restraining order cast doubt on Olivia's false claims of government authority. Faced with the possibility of decades in prison on conspiracy charges, he was offering total cooperation in exchange for immunity, hoping to save himself by turning on Olivia. The recordings he provided were a prosecutor's dream. Hours of conversations where Olivia openly discussed harassment strategies, coordination with hired crews, and plans to force a sale through intimidation. Every detail had been documented, every meeting, every plan, every participant, recorded and named. Martin had essentially built the evidence for his own prosecution while plotting the crimes. Within the hour, my attorney arrived to formalize his cooperation and start extracting everything he knew about Olivia's operation. Governor, this testimony supports federal conspiracy charges, fraud prosecution, and potentially organized crime allegations, my lawyer explained as he examined the files. We're looking at crimes across multiple states, property violations, and systematic abuse of authority. This is the kind of case that makes careers. She's planning something big this weekend, Martin added, checking his phone nervously like he half expected Olivia to storm in any second. I pulled out after the restraining order, but she believes one dramatic move will either force you to negotiate or create enough public pressure to back you off the charges. What he described made the earlier fence cutting look like childish vandalism. Martin left wearing a recorder that would capture every word Olivia said as she prepared her so-called final act. Federal investigators were already working with state prosecutors to monitor events and gather evidence that would end her harassment campaign for good. Olivia had no idea that her partner had flipped and was now the key witness sealing her downfall. When criminals start betraying each other, justice usually wins big. By Saturday morning, the weather was perfect. Bright skies that made Harold's ranch look like it belonged on a postcard celebrating American farm heritage. I had planned a small memorial that afternoon to honor Harold's life and rededicate the ranch to carrying forward the legacy he had spent 8 decades building. About 20 neighbors and family friends were expected, along with several community leaders who had stood by us through difficult times. What I hadn't planned was Olivia Sharp making her dramatic arrival like an unwanted guest at a wedding. Around noon, she pulled up at the front gate in a rental truck packed with what looked like moving equipment, flanked by 3 unfamiliar men. This was the grand finale Martin had warned about during his cooperation sessions. The recorder he wore had already captured her describing plans for a decisive confrontation to settle the property dispute once and for all. Where legal harassment had failed, Olivia was ready to try direct action. The rental truck pulled up just beyond our property line, close enough for Olivia to make her point, but technically outside the boundaries set by her restraining order. It was a calculated move, allowing her to stay in compliance with the law while still delivering maximum intimidation for whatever performance she had in mind. She stepped out dressed like an official inspector, clipboard in hand and a bundle of measuring tools slung over her shoulder as if she intended to carry out some bogus property review. Her crew followed, unloading surveying equipment and boundary posts clearly intended for remarking land they had no authority to touch. "Governor Grant," she shouted from the roadside, her voice carrying like she was addressing a campaign. "Rally rather than staging a crime in broad daylight. I'm here to perform a mandatory compliance inspection under state development codes and community protection regulations." I couldn't help but laugh. She was openly pretending to wield power she didn't have, standing next to instruments she was about to use in a criminal act, right as my guests were arriving for Harold's memorial. Those guests, friends, and colleagues who had respected Harold for decades, people who valued his dedication to preserving agricultural heritage and understood what our ranch meant to local history, were watching Olivia launch her little theater of false authority. On a day meant to honor Harold, she was stirring outrage across the community, the kind she might have predicted if she'd had even a shred of political sense. "That woman has no right to inspect anything on your land," declared retired Judge Peterson, who had driven 2 hours to pay his respects. "What she's describing sounds like criminal impersonation of a government official, and that carries serious federal charges." Phones came out across the crowd. Guests were already recording, sensing that Olivia's show would soon be replayed in courtrooms. She ignored them, hammering stakes into the ground and claiming to be correcting property lines according to some made-up community standards. Each marker landed on ranch soil that had been ours since the territory was first settled. Land she clearly intended to seize for her subdivision scheme. Olivia was committing surveyor fraud in front of 20 witnesses while trampling the restraining order that barred her from approaching the property. I walked down to the fence line, standing across from her for the first time since the courthouse. It felt like facing someone who had completely detached from reality. "Miss Sharp, you're violating court orders by setting foot near this property," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Every action you're taking right now is on record and will lead to new criminal charges. Governor or not, Mr. Grant, you're bound by the same community guidelines as anyone else here," she shot back, her tone smug and self-assured, as though she had never once faced consequences. "The Meadowbrook HOA has delegated state authority to preserve property values and neighborhood uniformity." I nearly laughed again. State authority? I was the one who actually held government power, and here she was pretending to speak for it. Things escalated when she moved toward Harold's memorial bench, a simple wooden seat he'd placed near. The family cemetery, a quiet spot for reflection. She stepped over the low brick border without hesitation, kicked aside the lilies I had set there just a week earlier, and jammed a flagpole into the earth barely 2 feet from Harold's name. "This is maintained property now," she declared, louder than necessary. That was it. My patience snapped. "Step away from that memorial immediately," I said, moving between her and the bench as everyone watched the confrontation unfold. I didn't stop there. I walked past her, pulled out my phone, and started a live stream. "Say that again for the court," I told her. Instead of backing down, she reached for the bench as if she meant to drag it away, forcing me to block her path. The bench was irreplaceable, Harold's legacy carved into wood. I couldn't allow her to touch it. Then came the moment harassment turned physical. She shoved against me, insisting she had authority to remove non-compliant structures. Immediately, I caught her wrist to keep her from damaging the memorial, and she shrieked about being assaulted by government officials interfering with legitimate HOA enforcement. 20 witnesses filmed every second as she tried to vandalize my grandfather's memorial. The scene looked like someone unraveling in real time, Olivia ranting about enforcement powers while physically struggling to push past me. Her crew froze, suddenly realizing they were watching their employer commit assault against a sitting governor in violation of a court order, on camera. "Call 911, I told Judge Peterson, holding my ground. "We need police here for assault, restraining order violations, and attempted destruction of memorial property." Within minutes, sirens cut through the evening air. 3 patrol cars, the county sheriff and Detective Williams, who specialized in cases of harassment and fraudulent authority, arrived at Harold's ranch. Olivia was still shouting about her legal right to remove the bench when the cuffs snapped around her wrists. Her hired crew was detained and questioned about their part in an organized property fraud scheme against protected historic land. I stood firm between her and Harold's memorial, knowing some battles must be met head-on. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. "I'll see you at the land reassessment hearing," she said. That hearing didn't even exist, but I knew it soon would. By Monday evening, the Meadowbrook Community Center looked more like a political rally than a meeting. The parking lot overflowed with residents from 4 different subdivisions, all demanding answers after word spread about Olivia's arrest at Harold's memorial. Ella and my legal team had organized the evidence, ready to present it publicly for the first time. Inside, the center was packed, standing room only, people spilling into hallways, others pressed against windows from outside. And it wasn't just Meadowbrook anymore. Homeowners from across the county had shown up, drawn by news of HOA fraud and harassment that sounded all too familiar. Tonight was never meant to be just another neighborhood gathering. It was destined to become a public reckoning. State Attorney Rebecca Chen had agreed to present the criminal evidence in front of everyone, not only to explain the charges against the HOA president, but also to encourage other victims to step forward. Chen was widely respected across the state for her work prosecuting organized crime and political corruption, and her presence at a community meeting signaled that this case had grown far beyond ordinary property disputes. When a prosecutor of her standing shows up at a local forum, it usually means someone is about to spend a very long time in prison. Ladies and gentlemen, Attorney Chen began as she connected her laptop to the projector, what I'm about to show you is one of the most extensive fraud and harassment cases our office has ever prosecuted involving false claims of government authority. She continued, Olivia Sharp has been running a criminal operation under the guise of HOA leadership, and many of you here have been her victims without realizing just how deep her crimes go. The presentation began with Martin's recorded confessions about the resort development plot. Silence fell across the community center as residents listened to Olivia's own consultant describe in detail the scheme to seize Harold's ranch through relentless harassment and calculated property damage. We identified the ranch as the main obstacle to resort construction and devised methods to force a below-market sale through coordinated intimidation. Martin's voice played through the speakers as shock and anger spread across the room. Attorney Chen then pulled up financial documents that exposed Olivia's theft of HOA funds. The records revealed fake special assessment fees for imaginary projects, bogus legal costs for services never performed, and maintenance contracts with Shell, companies that funneled money straight into her accounts. Over the past 3 years, Ms. Sharp has embezzled roughly $87,000 while publicly claiming transparency, Chen explained. Faces in the crowd showed the dawning realization that they had been systematically robbed. Next came security footage from Harold's ranch projected onto the large screens around the room. It showed Olivia's hired crew tearing down fence lines while discussing ways to target a cemetery for maximum emotional damage. Seeing their HOA president orchestrate crimes against a sitting governor during a period of family mourning triggered a wave of outrage across the community. Several neighbors broke into tears as they grasped how completely they had been betrayed by someone they had trusted to defend their interests. Chen explained further, Martin Greer has given us full cooperation in exchange for immunity, including recordings of planning sessions where Ms. Sharp discussed escalating crimes until Governor Grant was forced to sell his land. She displayed transcripts of those conversations, which revealed premeditated fraud, ongoing harassment, and plans that threatened both livestock and human health through potential water contamination. Ella then rose from her seat holding a folder of her own. She threatened 17 families with fake violations, charged unauthorized fees to at least 30 households, and invented architectural standards that don't exist anywhere in our official covenants. Ella declared to thunderous applause that rattled the windows. We've been living under a dictator who was stealing our money while pretending to wield legal authority she never had. The most explosive evidence came when Chen revealed Olivia's text messages detailing the plan that led to her arrest. The messages showed Sharp coordinating with associates to disrupt a family memorial service, attempting to remove graveside structures, and even committing assault against a governor while pretending to enforce regulations. Photographs of Olivia in handcuffs filled the screens. These actions show utter disregard for the law and clear danger to this community, Chen stated firmly. Tom Bradley then requested the floor. I've verified with county officials that 60% of the violation notices Olivia issued cited codes that don't exist anywhere in municipal law, he announced, holding up documentation. She's been threatening legal action over imaginary infractions while collecting fines on rules she invented. The room erupted into heated conversations as residents recognized years of harassment had been based entirely on fabricated regulations. By the end of Chen's presentation, the truth was undeniable. The residents had been victims of organized fraud masquerading as neighborhood governance. Olivia hadn't been protecting property values or enforcing real standards. She had been running a criminal scheme while pretending to hold government power. She had turned HOA leadership into a personal racket that preyed on the very community that elected her. Ms. Ducharp is currently being held without bail pending trial on federal conspiracy, fraud, harassment, assault, and violations of court orders, Chen concluded, to applause that would not stop. Additional charges will follow as we uncover more victims and evidence of her systematic crimes. Jim Foster then stood with HOA records that laid bare the scale of her theft. Based on my review, she stole over $100,000 through fake assessments and fraudulent contracts, he declared as neighbors calculated how much each household had lost. We are filing civil suits to recover stolen funds and demanding restitution for everyone she victimized. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to dissolve the corrupt HOA and rebuild under legitimate leadership. Residents recognized that HOA authority existed only through their consent, and they were revoking that consent from anyone who would abuse it. Ella was chosen as interim community coordinator, tasked with restoring honest leadership that would truly serve the neighborhood. Watching Olivia crumble before the very people she had deceived, I couldn't help but think how much my grandfather would have cherished this moment. The trial stretched on for 3 weeks, but the jury needed less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Watching Olivia Sharp sit in federal court as prosecutors laid out the overwhelming evidence of her conspiracy was witnessing justice in its purest form. Martin's recordings, my security footage, stolen fund records, and testimony from 47 victims created the kind of airtight case that defense lawyers dread. Federal Judge Harrison, who had handled organized crime cases for 3 decades, looked almost stunned as he prepared sentencing. Ms. Sharp, he announced while reviewing stacks of evidence, you stand convicted of conspiracy, fraud, harassment, assault on a government official, theft of community funds, false impersonation of authority, and repeated violation of court orders. Your crimes represent a deliberate betrayal of public trust and warrant the harshest possible sentence. Olivia's sentencing was everything I had hoped for when this nightmare began, with her felony trespassing into Harold's study. 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, followed by 5 years of probation. She was banned for life from any HOA or community leadership, ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution for damages, legal costs, and harassment compensation, and hit with permanent restraining orders keeping her away from our family and the ranch. She would never threaten another property owner again. Martin Greer, her partner in crime, avoided federal charges by cooperating, but state prosecutors went after him for business fraud. His real estate license was revoked, his consulting career destroyed, partnerships dissolved, and lawsuits piled on from investors burned by his schemes with Olivia. The man who once orchestrated systematic harassment of government property would now spend years in bankruptcy court explaining himself to angry creditors. The real victory, though, was the community's restoration. Residents elected Ella as the new coordinator, and her first act was a public apology for Olivia's harassment of Harold's Ranch during our mourning period. During the dedication of a memorial plaque honoring Harold's agricultural contributions, she said, "Governor Grant, our community is horrified by what was done to your family in our name. The HOA was rebuilt from the ground up, this time, under lawful oversight and democratic elections. Olivia's fake regulations vanished, stolen funds were recovered, and the abusive dictatorship disguised as community leadership finally became true representative governance." Harold's Ranch itself received permanent state historic protection, shielding it from development or harassment forever. The family cemetery was secured as a protected heritage site, immune from zoning or HOA interference. Federal surveys officially locked in our property boundaries, ensuring no one could ever again lay false claim over our land. Restitution payments funded cutting-edge security upgrades, cameras, motion sensors, alarms tied directly to county law enforcement. Ironically, Olivia's crimes had made Harold's Ranch one of the best protected private properties in the state. Our case even inspired state legislation, the Harold Grant Protection Act, creating felony penalties for HOA abuse, stolen funds, and harassment through false authority. Other states quickly began drafting similar protections. When Harold's long-delayed memorial service finally came, the day was perfect. Over 200 people gathered, neighbors, state officials, agricultural organizations, all honoring his legacy and celebrating the ranch's protection. I sat on Harold's memorial bench overlooking 6 generations of pasture, now secured for future generations. Attorney Chen stopped by with updates. More arrests were coming as investigators uncovered Olivia's wider fraud network. What began as harassment against our family had triggered federal reforms protecting thousands of homeowners across the country. Harold's ranch had become the spark for national change. As the sun set behind Harold's oak tree and the last guests departed, I walked through the house one last time, touching the furniture and photos that tied our family to this land since 1875. That night I signed the final documents establishing the ranch as a permanent agricultural heritage preserve. Harold's vision was no longer vulnerable, it was law. I placed the papers in Harold's old safe beside the legal shields that had carried us through Olivia's onslaught. Future generations would inherit not just land, but protections forged from our struggle. Harold had prepared for exactly this fight, and in the end, we prevailed. Standing on the porch beneath a star-filled sky, I knew justice had been fully served. Olivia was in prison, her conspiracy dismantled, the community restored, and Harold's ranch, our heritage, was safe forever. Justice may take its time, grandfather, but when it comes, it leaves nothing undone. Maybe that's the real lesson. Legacy doesn't just outlast corruption, it reveals it. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, you can always hit the thanks button to support the channel. Stay loud, stay rooted, and never let a Karen rewrite your family's story. You've just experienced another wild moment with QA Stories. Subscribe now for more chaos, laughter, and jaw-dropping tales.